Series, we felt probably it was a good idea not to try and hold this on the original date. So I thank you for being here with us this evening. Our Speaker Series, we go over environmental topics in the news and of interest to folks. And we've got some great topics this year. This is our first one for the year. The Speaker Series is one of two big things that the EQC does. The other is our Green Community Awards program, in which we recognize homeowners and businesses that are taking steps to reduce their footprint energy-wise, improve water quality, and other environmentally friendly practices. And so that's kind of fitting that our presenter this evening is a winner of the EQC Green Community Awards program. Be looking for the applications for this year's awards coming out probably in another couple weeks or months sometime. And then we typically tour the properties in June, make a judgment, and make an announcement of the winners sometime July and August. So there's still time to get your projects going because the Green Community Awards are really not so much for perfection as they are for their inspirational value. We want to show the things that can be done, like Paul's going to be doing here this evening, and inspire other folks in the community to do similar types of things. So that's the Green Community Awards. Be looking for that. And now on to the Speaker Series. Tonight's topic, improving water quality and conserving water at home. And this is what Paul wrote about his presentation. Changing how rainfall behaves on our properties makes a difference for water quality in our lakes, rivers, and streams. Now, the Freshwater Society's Master Water Steward Program, which Paul went through, and there have been other Shoreview residents as well, trains community residents how to get our properties to mimic the natural environment for better water quality. So Paul's going to show us how his home became an experiment station. Now, don't freak out if you want to do some stuff. You don't have to be an experiment station. Paul's done that for you. But he is going to show us some things about what you can do. So see what it takes to infiltrate rain back into the ground, reuse rainwater, and reduce the risk of having water in your basement. Paul is also going to share how residents can reduce their indoor and outdoor water use without breaking the bank. And then a little bit about Paul. He has worked in the recycling and solid waste industry for more than 2 decades, and he spent 4 years representing this area as a member of the state legislature. During the last 5 years, he has volunteered to learn about and improve water quality and quantity through the Master Water Steward Program. Paul has lived in Shoreview for the last 22 years with his wife, Michelle, and they have 2 children. Please, I will have the microphone if you have questions, so let me know. I'll wander around with that. And with that, let's welcome Paul Gardner.
Hi, everyone, and all you folks watching on cable. Thanks for coming out this evening. I even have an official Master Water Steward shirt. It is one of the most comfortable shirts I've ever worn. It's cold outside, but it feels great. So my name is Paul Gardner. I live on Dawn Avenue in Shoreview. We've lived here for 22 years. I consider myself an environmentalist and have worked in environmental stuff for many years, but it wasn't until I lost an election in 2010 that I finally looked at my own yard and went, my God, it looks like crap. There's just weeds everywhere. I'm not really sure what to do. I wasn't really aware of what I could do. And then as the years progressed after that, I was looking for some way to get my hands dirty, to not just talk about doing things elsewhere around the world or in the country, but doing things literally in my own backyard. And so along came the Master Water Steward Program that is offered by the Freshwater Society, and it is also facilitated through various watershed districts. This program runs about 30 minutes. I decided to cut it short on the water conservation side just because that would be like another half hour. But if someone really came here for that, I'd be happy to talk about that. So let me get into it here. Great. Since we're on cable, I can't move. Little cable joke, sorry. So, Master Water Stewards. This is a program created in 2013. The Freshwater Society is a 501c3 nonprofit based in St. Paul. They're 50 years old this year. They were looking for a way to accelerate improvement in water quality in Minnesota, like in our lakes, rivers, and streams, in addition to some of the work that professionals are doing around the state. They were looking to do something similar to a Master Gardener program. So they wanted to be able to educate volunteers and have them do outreach in their community about how to improve water quality. There's about 200 of us or so. That's a lot of shirts. This very intricate stitch work. It costs a lot of money. There's about 200 of us since 2013. They have a class that usually starts in October and runs through around April. They convene you all together just a few times in the Twin Cities Metro, but then you have these breakout groups every couple of weeks at your local watershed district office. And so Paige, my neighbor from the Ramsey, Washington Metro District, Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District, they would get together with the Capital Region Watershed District, which covers most of St. Paul, and we would do stuff together. So there was, I think, 8 of us in that group. So you do online classes where you learn about things that I didn't know as someone who was a history major with a concentration in Russian and East European studies. So math, science, engineering was not, I didn't excel in those things as well. So we learned about things from specialists on hydrology, people who manage stormwater, water policy, folks who are very good at communicating to people in the community to get you to do stuff. Tim knows all about this with community-based social marketing when you're trying to get people to do things like recycling. And then at the end, we had to do a capstone project, very similar to what you might do in college, where you have to show some mastery of something at the end. And I'll tell you about what my project was in a little bit. And then we're also required to have some ongoing education hours during the course of subsequent years. So I think we had to do 50 hours as part of our capstone project, and then I think it's 25 hours each year after that. I tend to do more than that, so I stopped keeping track. Here's the goal that we're trying to accomplish as Master Water Stewards, and it took me a lot of years to actually figure this out. This is stuff that the professionals in the field know very well, but for me, thinking that I was educated and thought about this, I just didn't figure it out. The graphic you see here are hypothetical examples of a quote-unquote natural environment, and then you have a more urbanized environment. And the issue for water quality here is that when water hits the natural environment here, more of it is going to infiltrate into the ground. Now, these numbers are approximate. Every area is different with different types of trees, different soils, topography, and the like, but they're giving you a hypothetical example of a natural area where roughly a quarter of the water goes deeper into the ground, where it could replenish aquifers. About a quarter is staying close to the surface, where it can serve as water for plant life. There's about 40% of it that evaporates and 10% that just runs off. So runoff is a word that we use constantly as master water stewards, and that goes into a lake, a river, or stream somewhere away from that area. However, as we have built the environment, as we have in Ramsey County, where the county is mostly developed, we've created a different situation with more impervious surface. And impervious surface is, as you can imagine, water does not get through it. So when water hits pavement in a parking lot or a sidewalk, it will go to into a storm sewer. And very little actually ends up back into the ground, as you can see from this graphic. And again, these numbers are approximate, but in the middle of the city, you might have 75 to 100% impervious cover. It's going to be a little lower here in the suburbs, but it kind of depends. So what we're trying to do as master water stewards, our goal is to get the picture on the right without turning it back to wilderness, to mimic more what is happening on the left, at least how it functions for where water is going. Now, in an urban and suburban environment, there's 2 major contributors to poor water quality in our local lakes, for example. One is phosphorus. Phosphorus is something we all need, but if you have too much of it, it can lead to the growth of algae in your local lake. I didn't get this until, I had always heard you shouldn't have leaves or you should always sweep up your leaves and grass off the pavement, but I could never really figure out why. But if you were to dump 5 bags of leaves into the storm sewer, that would release eventually about a pound of phosphorus. Again, all approximate numbers. and that leads to the creation of 500 pounds of algae. That's a lot. So if you dumped one bag in the storm sewer, you'd get 100 pounds of algae. So we want to keep phosphorus out. I could never figure out when I read a lot of planning documents when I was on the EQC why it was so important to get minute amounts of phosphorus out of the water, and that this explains why. The other main contaminant we're looking to reduce as master water stewards is sediment. And since everybody has to have their own nomenclature in their own field, it's total suspended solids, TSS, I'm just messing with you. Dirt, really. I mean, this is everything from sediment off your lawn after rain hits it. It can be what's called litter fall. This is little bits of bark, the flowering buds off your trees in the spring, just all that organic stuff that comes off of your property. It can be those little helicopter dealies that come off of your trees. Eventually, that stuff breaks down and it ends up in minute quantities in the water, and off it goes into your local lake. And it often has stuff with it that can cause problems with water quality. Now, I always thought that, naively, that rainwater hits the ground, and unless you have motor oil or transmission fluid or something in your driveway, that water is clean. And it gets to the storm sewer, and it's clean. And it sort of is. You wouldn't drink it, but you know, you could wash your hands in it, and if you get mud while you're walking the dog or gardening, you wash your hands in the storm sewer. But it has those very small amounts of phosphorus and sediment in it, which add up over time. We also are interested in nitrogen. Some of that comes from grass. Tim and I have been doing composting for years, and you always learn a little bit of brown leaves and green grass. You get the carbon from the leaves and the nitrogen from the grass, and suddenly you get compost. That isn't a huge problem for water quality like it is in rural Minnesota with agriculture. Nitrogen from farm fields from fertilizer application is really a huge problem, and a lot of private wells get contaminated that way. So here's how these things look on a larger scale. This is a map of the Rice Creek Watershed District. Rice Creek extends across 4 counties. You can see in the lower right, White Bear Lake. That's kind of a light green, and then you have 2 creeks through Washington and Anoka counties, Clearwater and Hardwood Creek, that eventually end up in, I think it's Lake Peltier and Lino Lakes in Centerville, and then it enters the line of lakes in Lino Lakes, and then eventually becomes Rice Creek, and then it flows into the Mississippi River in Fridley. So it actually cuts across a little bit of, or a part of the watershed actually cuts even in Hennepin County, although not much. All the colors there, it's not, the fine print isn't so important to get into, but the different colors imply different impairments. The state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, every 10 years measures all of our waters for certain contaminants. I actually work with them on a daily basis in my new job. And they look at different things like nutrients. Nutrients, again, we all need nutrients, but too much of it can lead to poorer water quality. So we have some things that are impaired for aquatic recreation because you don't really want to swim in it. Those are those lakes in Lino Lakes. They're very shallow and they're filled with carp, and it's really gross. Aquatic consumption, there's lakes like Turtle Lake. Does anyone want to know what the pollutant is in Turtle Lake that they flag that for? It's mercury. It's from airborne emissions from coal-burning power plants. We can't really do much about that as master water stewards other than ramp up renewable energy, and that's happening, but it's going to take a while for any of that to change. But you don't really want to eat a lot of fish out of Turtle Lake. Those are a couple of examples of impairments, and so these things have all been mapped all over the state, and now we're trying to figure out things large and small that we can do to improve that situation. The good news is, and people rarely hear good news about environmental stuff. I'm an environmentalist, but you all get email, you see clickbait stuff on social media, and you all just think you're going to die. You're going to die tomorrow if we don't, send some money. And then you send some money, and the next week it's, well, we solved that problem, but you're going to die from something else. And you rarely hear, and this is true from politics, you rarely hear about good news because it isn't newsworthy. And I just wanted to let you know, Minnesota has got lots of good news about clean water. The first is we actually do measure what pollutants we have in our waters. I've been to a lot of other states in my solid waste work, including in the Midwest, they don't know what they don't know. They don't test and know what's out there. We at least know what we're trying to clean up. And we have a plan for how to mitigate the problem. We also have a lot of public support for clean water. Everybody says they're for clean water, but the voters, you in 2008, voted to tax yourself 0.3% more in your sales tax to help support the arts and cultural heritage, outdoor heritage such as habitat for hunting, parks and trails, and clean water. 1/3 of that money, or about $250 million every 2 years in the state budget, goes to clean water. And in fact, I get to help administer some of that. That is what my job is now. And candidates tend to win who are for clean water. If you're helping polluters, your chances, especially in this area, is not very good. So we have funding. You see the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment that was approved in 2008. That's their logo. There's also money from the lottery that has gone into research, usually through the University of Minnesota and other institutions, to look at emerging contaminants that maybe we're not that familiar with. Again, about $250 million every 2 years from that legacy sales tax. You also pay for water quality on your property taxes. Watershed districts have levying authority, so if you're in northern Shoreview, more or less, you're paying maybe $50 to $100, depending on your home value, to the Rice Creek Watershed District. If you're south of here, more or less, you're in the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District, and you pay about $50 to $100 in your property taxes, more or less. And there's also money from the state budget and what we call general obligation bonding. If you want to talk bonding, I can do that, but I don't really want to do that. So here's some examples of things. These aren't master water steward things, but these are just examples of the good news, okay? So here's an example. This is Hardwood Creek, a tributary of Rice Creek. This is in Washington County, or is it southeastern Anoka County? Pretty close. It's sort of where 35E and W meet, more or less, just west of there. So roughly 100 years ago, farmers did what was an acceptable and understandable practice. They wanted to get water off the land as soon as possible so that they could plant and not have their crops flooded out. Very understandable. And so people came along with technology and said, let's dig a ditch. And so they dig the ditch and then fill in the stream with the fill from the ditch. So you can see where it says old channelized pattern. That's where the ditch was. But now this area isn't, well, it is farmed, but they work with the landowners at the Rice Creek Watershed District, and they reestablish the meandering path of the stream. So that makes the stream actually longer. It's curved, so it slows the water down, and that's what we're looking to do. And so sediment has less chance to get, or less chance for erosion, which leads to sediment getting into the water. It also has better vegetation to help fix nitrogen if you have stuff coming off your farm field. But it also cuts down on other stuff going down there. It's, I'll show you a picture of Rice Creek in a minute, but they've re-meandered parts of Rice Creek in Shoreview and Arden Hills, and when you paddle down it, you can see, you know, this isn't rocket science stuff. I mean, things like tree stumps that are stapled with these large steel staples into the side of the eroded embankment to help reduce that erosion, but it also creates little pools where aquatic life can go in there when it used to be a ditch and the water would just go right down. So this is part of the area that was restored in Rice Creek. That's my son, Ben, there, and this is our homemade canoe that my in-laws and my wife made about 30 years ago. It's a redwood canoe. If you didn't hear the road noise, you wouldn't know that you were in the middle of a large metropolitan area. Lots of birds and bugs. Here's another example, and these are the expensive things, relatively speaking. The Maplewood Mall, I'm just sucking up the page here because the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District worked on this. The Maplewood Mall has 70 acres of land, and before anyone worked on clean water there, only 3% of the water that hit that property as rain ended up infiltrating into the ground. Today, it's 67%. And the reason for that is the Rice Creek, or the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District. You got to have something shorter than that page. Worked with the owner of the Maplewood Mall. That attracted some state money from the Clean Water Fund, from that dedicated sales tax. And that also attracted some federal money. And so for $6.5 million over 4 years, They put in things like tree trenches, rain gardens, a cistern, and permeable pavers to absorb a lot of that water. And so now we treat the land like a sponge. Or that's my term, it's not an official master water steward term, rather than treating it like an umbrella where everything is shed off the land. And that has improved water quality in Coleman Lake. Did I say that right? Just downstream, and I believe that eventually flows to the Mississippi. Is that right? So we're actually helping people downstream from us by reducing the amount of nutrients that are going downstream. Just a couple of other examples. This is actually the headquarters at the Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District using permeable pavers. This has also been used on, is it Oak Ridge Avenue in Shoreview on the south side of Turtle Lake. So it lays out like tile. You put it down there and water infiltrates through the pavers. You have to have a good shop vac, right, to get the soil that comes out of there. But I have something a little bit like this at my house just for a very small section, and dirt really builds up over time. That's when you really notice how the sediment starts to build up. Mark Maloney for the Public Works Department here at Shoreview has presented on some things the city has done, and this is one of the things he really pioneered, which is the permeable concrete on the lower picture. And if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't use sand, and it's very porous. And so they did this neat little YouTube video where they dumped a truckload of water onto this street in the Woodbridge neighborhood of Shoreview, and the water just kind of disappears. So those are examples of more expensive things, but again, good news that you probably don't see every day, and people are doing this slow, kind of unsexy work of improving water quality using your tax dollars. So let's get to water stewards. So we're not trained to be engineers or anything. We're not trying to do massive projects like the watershed districts are doing. We're trying to do things that are on a small neighborhood scale, things that almost anybody could do. We want to give people a whole range of so-called best management practices, or BMPs, so that you can use whatever is appropriate for your yard. But again, the idea is to stop rain, is where we call it stop rain where it drops, or as close to where it drops as possible, keep it on the land, and slow it down, and keep it out of the storm sewer as much as possible. Here's a couple of examples of projects that we do, the 200 of us who are master water stewards. One is rain gardens. I always thought that was I had heard of rain gardens, and I heard they were by parking lots for years, and that they were good for water and native plants, but I didn't really understand how they worked. But the basic idea is you dig a depression in the ground, you dig it a little deeper than you really want it, put some sand and compost in the bottom of it, which allows for more porosity and infiltration of the water that goes in it. And then the water would come from a paved surface, an impervious surface. And in my case, at our house, we used downspouts that fed right into it. But then you use native plants that go, there are some that are put in the bottom where it's very wet. They're very good for moist environments. You have some plants that are on the sides that don't need as much moisture, and then you have stuff that's a little drier. They have very deep root systems, and they can go 10 feet or more underground, and they're very good at retaining moisture and digging fissures into the soil for water to infiltrate. My capstone project was rain barrels. So I worked with a local nonprofit that distributes these anyway with an online portal, and then I worked with Ellen to get a targeted email list of people who are interested in the environment in Shoreview, and let them know that they could get some discounted rain barrels. And then Paige and the folks at the Watershed District subsidized it, so they only cost $20. And we sold 100 in 48 hours, and then we probably could have sold more if we had them. And then we distributed them in about 3 hours over there at Public Works on a Saturday. And then as part of that, I was also supposed to help people install them if they wanted to. That was part of my volunteer hours. And so there were about a dozen people who said, I don't know how to set this up, can you help me? And we just worked through how they would do it. Another popular program that some master water stewards do is to adopt a drain. This is more common in cities where you have parallel street parking, like Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have, you're not really supposed to park on the street, like overnight, so we don't have a lot of folks on the street, and we have pretty efficient street sweeping. But the idea here is you get your neighbors to make sure that they're raking up leaves out of the gutter in the fall, and at other times to keep that from going in the storm drain and releasing phosphorus and creating algae in your local lake. The city of St. Paul, for example, has flyers and door hangers that you can go to your neighbors with to let them know that they can clean it up, or you can organize a cleanup event on your street. So those are quite popular. So in thinking about our own homes, I'm a linear thinker. I mean, I just think in order all the time, and so I have a hard time working with people who are thinking about 10 things all at the same time and doing them simultaneously. It's neither as bad, but it's just how I do it. But I was trying to think methodically at my own property to figure out how much impervious surface do I have at my house. And I just started doing some math. Again, not my forte, but we learned how as master water stewards. We have a pretty standard lot, a quarter-acre lot in Shoreview. The house was built in 1972. It's 2,200 finished square feet and 2 stories. But as I started doing the math, half of the lot is impervious. And that was a lot. So I was trying to figure out how to make my property more like a sponge rather than that umbrella that sheds off the water, with one exception, which is to not have it be like a sponge right by the foundation. So when we had the polar vortex winter 5 years ago, very similar to this, with a very large snowpack, in April it all started melting, and then it rained, and then my sump pump seized up, and I had water in the basement, and that put me on the journey to doing what I'm about to show you. So I did not want water in my basement. That's how I met Paige. I called, I said, I need help. And she and the folks at the Ramsey Conservation District, now the Ramsey County Conservation Division, came out, and within a day they had a plan for how to deal with that drainage and also to do something better for water quality. And I had a rain garden put in. Knowing what I know now, I probably could have done it myself, but I'm glad I didn't. The idea here in red is the area where I'm trying to get water away from the house and away from the foundation and do something to get it to infiltrate into the ground away from the house. Did some math here. It's 9% of the total property, about 18% of all the impervious surface of the house. 3 downspouts feed into drain tile now, underground, and then they go into the rain garden, which is the area on the right just above where my car is there. The great advantage for this is it keeps water out of my sump system, so it doesn't really operate much at all now, which has been great. And I can leave town in nice weather and not come home to a wet basement. So the linear thinking here is that I'm just trying to divvy up my house by areas of impervious surface and figure out what to do. So we created a rain garden. You can see an aerial view on the right. There are actually 2 ponds in this thing. They're not really ponds, but you can tell it's just rained. In a rain garden, the water is supposed to drain within 24 hours. Otherwise, you get mosquitoes develop after a couple of days. And this has worked exactly as designed. If the water is really heavy, like an inch of rain, it will bubble up or bubble over what's called an armored saddle. There's rock in between the 2 ponds there, and the water will go into the lower one. And that lower pond also accepts water from the street. So in the middle picture, we wanted to have a curb cut and then a sort of a sluice, a concrete sluice right into the rain garden. But it turns out we had a gas line there. And so thanks to some quick thinking from the watershed district, they put in a sump. And so there's several feet of crushed gravel right there off of the curb cut, and then some permeable pavers on top. That's where you realize about the total suspended solids, because every couple of weeks in the summer I clear that out so that the water can still go through. And thanks to Michael Schumann at Ramsey County, he worked with my wife to do the plant selection. And so we had stuff like irises, which grow very well in that wet environment, and then other things that bloom throughout the year that are on the edges. And so now we have something blooming all year round. So the middle picture is actually taken around Memorial Day. The picture on the left, and I want to say that's about July or so, once the black-eyed Susans start coming out and the purple coneflower. This has solved so many problems, but it's also given us a twofer here, and then it's a great habitat. If you sit on my front step, during the summer, you can just listen, and you can hear dragonflies buzzing through there. You can hear birds going after some of the bugs that are in the rain garden. So we've got some monarch caterpillars. You see the monarch itself and the purple coneflower there. At the lower right of that 4-square thing is a damselfly, something I'd never even heard of until last year. And they're about 1 inch long, and they hunt in packs. And you know what they like to eat? Mosquitoes. We rarely have mosquitoes in the front yard because of that. And on the lower left, I think that is a eastern tiger swallowtail. Ha-ha. We've had, I keep making a list every time I see something and manage to identify it, but 8 types of butterflies have showed up in the front yard, which has been great, and 6 dragonflies, damselflies, and skimmers. So we have a lot of critters in there, and countless bees. Bee species differ very slightly, and I cannot tell the difference, and I cannot watch them fast enough, and I need a better camera. But we have stuff crawling all over, and you can hear not just the dragonflies and the birds, but you can hear the bees. And so all I can do is try and take a quick picture. So then I looked at the side of the house. This is at the east side of our house. It's on the bottom here. It's a garage and a screen porch, and that's 7% of the whole property, 14% of the impervious surface. 2 downspouts go out of there, and they did go this way. There's sort of a swale here that's just constantly wet. It's clay soil, so it doesn't drain very well, and it just goes in sheets right into the street. So we've got 2 pairs of rain barrels. We never use the hose in the summer, and I've never run out of water. In fact, I try and drain the barrels when I can if I know there's a heavy rain going to come, because I know they'll fill up again. And you can attach a hose to these and run it. And I had to water some trees, which I get from the city of Shoreview. Get your tree sale purchases done now online at the Shoreview website. But I needed to water them, and so I just hooked them up to the hose, and I'd just go out there every day, flip the switch, run it on my phone. I'd put a 5 or 10 minute timer and then shut it off, and then I was able to water the trees, and they're doing just great. Had to do a little math here. So this is interesting. For every inch of rain that you have, you get 0.62 gallons per square foot. A handy thing to know. It's like miles and kilometers. I think there's 0.62 miles to a kilometer. Same idea. But these 2 barrels will hold 100 gallons, or excuse me, 90 gallons. And so just under an inch of rain will fill these 2 barrels. So it's turned out to be actually a useful rain gauge. I can figure out how much rain we've gotten. There's also up at the top there, I didn't get a good picture of it, is a downspout diverter. And so there's, it looks like a Y-shaped thing, and then if the switch is flipped one way, it'll go to the rain barrel. If it's switched the other way, it'll continue to go down the downspout. So I discovered, after taking this Master Water Steward class, looking at my yard, that I had rock mulch put down by a previous owner 30 years ago, and it was just full of weeds, and my wife said she spent 100 hours weeding in there. I don't know why we bothered, but it was all on top of this weed barrier. There were no weeds growing from underneath, but over time, all that litter fall and other stuff that had landed there, the organic material turned to soil, filled in all the rocks, and there was an inch or 2 of just mucky rock, and then it didn't drain very well in the spring. But all that impervious black plastic underneath just kept water from infiltrating, and so it was just sheeting again off. If the water goes to the back or the side or the front, it doesn't matter. All it ends up in Snail Lake. So it also ended up being a lake once the snow melted. But that was 16% of the entire property. And so what did I do? I just thought, I'm just going to start pulling back this plastic. So this is something that didn't cost me much. It isn't costing me much, but it is taking a lot of time. And I will tell you, as someone who's a political junkie, the last 2 years, let's just say, there's more than enough information that I need, and I just need to unplug from the news and the world, and there's nothing better than just going out in the yard and digging. But I'd pull back the black plastic, which you can see in the lower right. I'd filter out the dirt from the rocks. I'd lay down a pervious plastic layer, which I just got at the hardware store, so weeds won't grow through it, but water will flow through it going down. And before I did that, I would churn it up a little bit with a shovel, which allowed just to break up that clay soil. And then I put the rock back on top. So I am 75% of the way done, and I should be done this year, assuming I can get in the yard before May. But it now infiltrates better than the grass. You can see what it looked like on the bottom of the picture. There's more dirt than rocks, and now it's just rock. I also got to find out where my boundaries were, to find out where the black border is the previous owner put in. This isn't a very impervious area, but we just had a lot of weeds growing in the front yard. And in the water steward class, we had an extra class about turf alternatives. And I never, ever since I was a kid, and my dad made me use a mow 2 acres with a push mower, one of those Yardmaster deals that was never sharpened. I just thought, we don't need grass. That's what my son says too. We don't need grass. So I was looking for something other than grass that's just going to turn brown in the summer. And we were also interested in attracting pollinators, but what could we do there? And that 200 square foot piece of property turned out to be an excellent place for our little experiment station to put in a bee lawn. There's a, I think at the University of Minnesota, they call it a bee lab, where they actually are trying to understand how to save our bees, which are a major economic asset for us, because we truck bees to the West Coast, to California, to help pollinate fruits and vegetables. And North Dakota and Minnesota are huge bee colony centers, and they're endangered because of some pesticides that are being used. So the U of M is looking for places around Minnesota where people can attract pollinators. So what we did here is some of my master water steward friends came over. We put some of that soil down. It came from my rocks, very helpful reuse opportunity. And we planted some thin fescue. I didn't really know anything about turf or grass. I could never grow it very well at all. I always was terrible at it. But you could just go down to Beischwinger's and get Chewings fescue. And there's another one, red something fescue. It grows very thin. It grows very long. It's not very stiff. So it's not something you'd want to walk on a whole lot. But it also is very drought tolerant. And you can also cut it very high. I have a neighbor, I hope he's not watching, but he cuts it like this much, and then he's wondering why he needs to water the lawn all the time. If you let it grow longer, it obviously retains more moisture. But in this case, I'd be able to use my mower less often than a regular lawn, but it grows about this high. But then mixed in with that are several flowering, or types of flowering ground cover, I call it. One's called Heal-All. And in the spring, in theory, if it ever comes, we will have some pink and purple flowers growing there that will attract bees at the time that they need food the most. So that's how we took out another part of the lawn. The driveway, a little more complicated. We're going to have to wait till we replace the concrete driveway. I think what we can do is do a trench drain at the base of it and have that feed into the rain garden, which is that sort of dirty patch on the in the right center of the picture. That would involve some concrete, and I don't want to mess up with concrete, so I think we're going to wait till we replace that. But there are lots of other tools. You can use permeable pavers for this. After doing some research on it, I found that clay soil is really bad for using pavers. It just doesn't infiltrate very quickly, and so it isn't really a possibility. But if you have sandy soil, as many of you may do in Shoreview, it could be a definite option. Finally, the back of our roof. This is where now I go to everybody's. So Tim and I, as recycling people, anytime we go somewhere, we always want to know what people are doing with the recycling, or if you're into energy, you're always looking at the light bulbs. And so now that I I'm into being a master water steward. I look at everybody's downspouts now. Where do the downspouts go? Well, so the last two downspouts in my yard go into the yard. You can actually see them sticking out at the upper left and the lower left, and they just go into the yard. And you think, well, that's good. It's better than going on pavement, but also a substantial part of the property. But here's what happens: that clay is so compacted. There's the rocks that I was bragging about on the left, dry as a bone. This is in January when we had a little bit of thaw and snow, and then I have standing water. And that's actually all ice now, and then I have 2 feet of snow on top of it right now, so it's going to be fun. But this is where I learned a little bit more about lawn care than I thought, and I need to get an aerator, which would help water infiltrate in there and get some more oxygen down to the roots of this grass. Almost done here. So there are things that you can do. I would encourage you to have a plan, a multi-year plan, so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. We waited 15 years at least before we did anything in our yard because we thought we had to do everything at once and have some plan, and we never had a plan. And you can seek help. So one option is to find someone like me, a master water steward. I'd be happy to look at your yard. I've done it for a couple people, and we're just waiting for the snow to melt so we can actually do some things. I can also refer you to your local watershed district, so there are folks like Paige and folks at the Rice Creek District also who can actually work through that with you, and the Ramsey County Conservation Division. So we can help find you someone to do it. We are looking for more places that want to help keep water out of the storm sewer. That's what we want to do. And there is money available to help you. So they used to call them cost share programs. Sometimes now it's a water quality grant. In my case, I actually got about 40% of my rain garden paid for by the watershed district because they are trying to help get these best management practices in place. So there are people who are willing to give you help and money to see this through. And it doesn't have to be a huge, ambitious thing. I started with the rain garden because I needed to keep water out of my basement, and suddenly I've done other stuff. And I hope if you ever stop by my house, you would say, that's not a hippie house. This is not $1 million eco house. It's just a 1972 Rambler that now is more like a sponge on the property than it was before. And in fact, in some years, the watershed districts have more money than projects. It kind of depends, but sometimes they are looking for good projects. So if you are even this much willing to have someone check things out, we want to help you. So I've probably gone over. I think it would be good to do the water conservation maybe next year. I was certified as a water conservation advisor by taking a little extra training, and we did what would it be like to do appliance audits and looking at your lawn sprinkler if you have one. And it turns out there are huge water savings to be had from inefficient sprinkler systems. And once the spring comes, I'm going to work with Ellen and the folks at the city with folks who may be looking for finding more efficiencies in a sprinkler system. Because there's people are using 800 to 900 gallons a day, and they may not even know it because they run their sprinkler systems at 4 in the morning. So we would love to reduce the amount of groundwater we're using. Tim, I'll leave it there.
Actually, I'll put in a plug then. Using an improved sensor system on your irrigation system and reducing your water usage is eligible for a Green Community Awards. In fact, we've got Town Home Association representative here that won an award for doing that.
Yeah, it is hard to get a return on investment for a lot of water conservation in your house because water still is pretty cheap. However, outside, things like those rain sensors actually pay for themselves usually in a year. So you definitely can save some money.
Do we have any questions?
So, Paul, you touched on some of like the sediment clean out that you have to do in the rain garden. Can you talk about some of the other maintenance that you do for that rain garden?
Right. So in the spring with the rain garden, we've probably got 30 or 40 plants in there, and some of the old stuff we kind of clear out, and some weeds will start to pop up. We do mulch in between, but we find the more dense the plant cover is, the less chance weeds have a chance to take root. And that's very positive. And as I get older, now that I'm 51, I'm interested in doing less maintenance. I want to do things up front that take less time later. Like my wife was saying, she spent 100 hours with those rocks weeding this stuff. Now it should take us 20 minutes, you know. But with the maintenance in the rain garden isn't anything that's particularly strenuous or different than what you might do from unwinterizing. What do you call it when you unwinterize? You're getting your yard to spring back. It's not particularly difficult. And the nice thing about the native plants is because of those deep root systems, they are also okay when it's dry. And so you do not, except for the first year when you establish the plants, you don't really need to water them. And the first year I used my rain barrels and I was out there watering my plants. But once they take hold and have those deep root systems, you don't need to do it. So your maintenance is actually reduced. You're not out there every day with your annuals watering everything. So does that answer your question? I know you know the answer already, but and of course I'm not having to do the maintenance of cleaning out my basement if there's water in the basement. That's a huge risk reduction strategy that really fits in with the whole return on investment. Yeah.
How do they make concrete permeable, and does it last as long as impervious concrete?
Great. I'm assuming they got picked up about permeable concrete. So, I thought about using that, but my understanding is there's no sand in it, and the sand works to seal up all the little fissures when you're pouring concrete. But Mark Maloney at the city tells me that it isn't really, it's a lot more expensive in a residential setting because it's not as viscous, would be the right word. It doesn't flow as well off a truck. And so you need more people to actually scoop it out and spread it and smooth it out than standard concrete. And so that causes the price to be considerably higher. And in my case, I also have clay soil, so it's not really a great option. I actually wanted to divert water from it and send it to the rain garden where it can infiltrate. But you asked me about what's in it and then the cost.
And how long it lasts.
Oh, how long it lasts? Well, that's a good question. We'll find out in the Woodbridge neighborhood in Shoreview. I had read some follow-up reports and that some of the sediment that does get into those fissures into the concrete can clog it up a little bit and reduce its effectiveness over time. With the permeable pavers, you have the same issue, but you can use a shop vac and get into the crevices there. And I have that issue with my sump, that permeable pavers over that crushed gravel coming off the street, where I just use a little shovel and dig out. So that's a maintenance item, but it's pleasant maintenance.
All right. Were there any other questions? If not,
I do have a list here of all the species that I discovered, if you want to pass that around.
well, Paul, we'd like to thank you, and as a appreciation, we've got a card and
Oh, nice.
a cutting board from Wood from the Hood. These are downed trees in the city of Minneapolis that they reuse and make into cutting boards.
Nice.
So if we would thank Paul for his presentation.
Thank you very much. That's great.
And then please be sure to join us next month. Well, actually, it's not next month. It'll be later this month because we delayed last month's to tonight. Should we care about carp in the Owasso chain of lakes? And I would say that that's kind of a rhetorical question because the answer, of course, is yes. And should be more about why should we care about carp in the Owasso chain of lakes? And that will be on the regular scheduled date, which is always the third Wednesday of the month. In this case, will be March 20th. So please join us then, and thank you again for coming this evening, and we'll see you in about 10 days.